It's evident that he cares. What do you care about? Welcome to the Rock Newman Show. It's the Rock Newman Show.
There's some divine guidance.
Exactly.
Because we've been working on this. We've been working on putting this show together
Right.
for the better part of 6 months.
Exactly.
And it happens to be, here we are tonight, March the 20th, where the issue of reparations has never been as front and center as it is now in the political debate. So in terms of timing, we're right on time.
Exactly.
So look, here's something I want to do. I've been correctly accused since birth of being extraordinarily literal. And when I read the 13th Amendment, hadn't looked at it in a long time, but when I read the 13th Amendment that quote unquote freed the slaves, here's what I see. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime. Now I'll just stop right there. Because that word, as a literal person, that word accept, not accept, but accept, scares the hell out of me.
And it should. I mean,
and I want you all to weigh in on that.
we see the effects of it with the carceral state that we have now. We see inordinate amounts of black bodies, men and women, in prison, over-sentenced, penalized. And we know, as political scientists and others in social sciences, the darker you are, the more likely you're to get a harsher sentence, the less sympathetic you are. I mean, even black children aren't seen as children.
Let me ask you something there. You said the darker you are. Are you speaking of white versus brown and black? Or are you saying that, for example, a black person of a darker hue is likely to get a longer sentence or more severe punishment than someone of a lighter hue?
I'm saying both things. Right? So there is this sort of white, non-white binary in terms of the way we sentence. And then within categories, we know that the work of Veshel Weaver and Tracy Birch, at Northwestern has looked at this about the way that juries see darker complected people. So it is a both and issue. So both people who are not white get sentenced harsher, and those people who are within that category that we call black, the darker they are, the harsher.
So judges and juries are looking at skin color, and that skin color that is more towards black than it is towards light or brown or whatever. So within that structure, the darker skinned African American is likely to get more harsher treatment than his lighter skinned brother.
Absolutely.
William Darity has done some work on this also with respect to the death penalty, and makes this a similar argument that it applies to who gets the death penalty applied and who doesn't. So it's not just for broadly criminal justice, but now we're talking about the death penalty.
That is fascinating, and frankly, I had not heard it. Wow.
And scary.
That's a heavy. That's a heavy blow.
Absolutely, which is why that exception in the 13th Amendment is essentially laying out why we should be really concerned about incarceration and mass incarceration, in particular in our communities, because it essentially says the criminal justice system can make you a slave.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I see this word accept, I couldn't wait to talk to you guys because I wanted to get you all are scholars on this subject matter. And I'm just wondering if I had overreacted, really paying attention to it now and seeing it saying accept, because what accept means is, by definition, is that there can be slavery if you're punished of a crime.
Absolutely. I mean, we see it with prison industries, right? I mean, these persons who are in prison are working for pennies, essentially, right? They are getting no time toward, or no monies, right, toward their own furnishings and upkeep in the prison. I mean, we look at sort of that history post-enslavement with using convicts, right, and for picking cotton and building highways, chain gangs. That history is enmeshed with that clause in that amendment.
Even if we think about the forest fires and the fires that happened in California.
Right.
Most recently.
Right, so incarcerated people were used as firefighters, and they were paid $1 a day to risk their lives just as other firefighters. And as climate change continues and we have natural disasters, I think this becomes something that is even scarier about how their labor can be used.
So if we're real about this, someone putting their life on the line to go into the forest to fight the fire that is destroying lives that could potentially kill them, and they're making $1 a day, that is tantamount to slavery.
Right, and with no benefits if they're killed, right? And then their families get nothing, as other firefighters might get if they lose their lives.
So this should be a 10-alarm fire bell that we set off here.
Absolutely, and I mean, and much respect to the scholars in this area and the activists in this area, because they have been talking about this for decades, literally, about the ways in which we use imprisoned people for everything from making chairs to pressing license plates, that it was never a fair system that was going to pay these people a fair wage, which is why we transferred these practices and these production to prisons and not to non-incarcerated citizens.
Yeah. Okay. So back specifically to reparations. There is something that you don't hear much about, and it's called compensated emancipation. So when I looked at that as we were preparing, compensated emancipation. Well, we find out that the government paid slave owners for forcing them to free their slaves. They paid the slave owner for them losing their property. But the property, and it's quoted, for losing their property. The property, of course, are human beings defined by the Constitution as only 3/5 human. And they got nothing.
Exactly. And it's a fundamental tension between property rights and individual human rights. Okay. And this is an exact example of
What do you
this.
mean when you say that?
So when I say that, it's the property rights, the rights of the owners of the enslaved people are seen to have been violated because they've lost their property. Has been outweighed against the human rights of the individuals who lost their freedom and they were enslaved. And we've seen this in history. So we were talking about this the other night in the debates about the Emancipation Proclamation and whether or not reparations should be a part of it. President Lincoln considered, should there be reparations for formerly enslaved people, or should there be reparations for the slave owners who've lost slave income and their property? And there was such a national debate about it that he did nothing, so it's absent. We've also seen when the Haitian Revolution, when Napoleon was ousted, Napoleonic France, the US, UK, and France said this could never happen again. We have to make sure. So reparations was placed on Haiti, 80% of the GNP for 150 years.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
and the argument was France lost property and slave income and must be compensated.
That continues to this day.
To this day, you can't even understand Haiti, why Haiti's the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere, without understanding these reparations that were placed on it. And the Haitian claim today for reparations is grounded in this.
Did I hear you say 80% of GDP, of Haiti's GDP?
For 150 years.
How do you ever rise from abject poverty, paying 80% of your GDP to a foreign power?
Well, and I think this is part of that story, right? This is a penalty, right? So it's not just about compensating property losses to France. It's about penalizing Haiti, because what Haiti does is upset this whole order, right? If you are a free black republic in the Western Hemisphere and the United States, Great Britain still have slave owning interests, then you are a danger to our property. And that's exactly what they saw Haiti as at the time. And so this is a penalty for Haitians deigning to do what Americans, right, and the French and the British were talking about, right, about being free, about the right to
Let me ask you, that is in your face shackling. That's shackling of a nation. In your research in this subject matter, has there been anything, have you seen any efforts that you believe might try to break that bond, might try to break those chains
between Haiti and
between Haiti and France?
There have been some on the international arena talking about the IMF and others stepping in to halt, which is essentially theft, right, of Haitian transfers of wealth to France. I don't know how much traction it was able to get, but I know at least for a moment there was some conversation, particularly after the earthquakes, the sort of back-to-back natural disasters, that this was essentially going to break the nation of Haiti.
Yes, and then also the Caribbean countries have come together in a very innovative way to use regional organizations to basically pull their sovereignty together, their power together through CARICOM, their regional organization, to pursue reparations for slavery from the UK. Haiti has joined this effort, and its claim is about France. And so it's one of the few times, and this is what's happening with Global South countries, period, is using their international organizations as a way to counter the power of the most developed countries in the world. So the CARICOM 10 points have diffused across the planet, I should say the diaspora, as saying these are the harms, this is for which we should have reparations, and it's mobilized not just people in the Caribbean, but African Americans who are holding conferences about reparations and saying we should follow these points as well.
So in 1989, 30 years ago,
Phew.
you probably know where I'm going. John Conyers.
Say it.
John Conyers introduced HR 40 with a request, a respectful, polite request that Congress study, just simply study, no demand or anything. Let's just study this issue. And for 30 consecutive years, this has been batted down, swatted away, dealt with in the most condescending nature, where it's never been considered. Now, sitting right where you all are sitting now, I had a guest, a senator, Chris Van Hollen, who shocked me in stating that it was something that he wanted to try to revive and to introduce. So we've had that 30-year struggle. If you all would opine on what it says about this government, that for 30 years there's just been abject refusal to even study the issue.
Well, I think for me, I think it leaves no one, it lets no one off the hook, right? So this has not made it out of committee, whether it was a Democratic controlled House or not, right? So this is true for this last 30 years, that we've seen changes in power that should have been more hospitable to something like an HR 40, and it hasn't happened. So I think it says something about the sway and the power of white supremacy, and a lack of respect for the dignity, right, of Black people in this country, to not even take up the challenge of studying this issue. And that's really all the HR 40 asks for. It doesn't have a price tag attached. There are no questions about who's guilty and who's not. It just says, let's study the effects of the enslavement, Jim Crow periods on current Black life. And we have the resources and the wherewithal to do that. And I think the idea that even studying it is an affront is something that really makes this issue particularly difficult to reckon with and reconcile. Because if I'm saying I know that I am hurting and I don't know exactly what the cause is, but I know it has something to do with this other stuff. I just need
this other stuff called slavery.
This other stuff, slavery, Jim Crow, and environmental racism, right? Federal policies, federal housing policy, all of these things conspired over time to create the conditions of contemporary Black life. But I don't know exactly how to connect those dots. This congressional panel would have been able to do that for people, because people don't need you to tell them that something is wrong. They know it's wrong.
Yeah,
They just don't know how
They're
to
living-
articulate it.
they're living
They're
the
living the
wrongness of it.
wrong. We can look in D.C. right now and we can see where the harm is. But people don't really have a language for how to do that. And this would give people a language and the heft and the authority of the congressional data collection to be able to make those kinds of claims. And I think we see here that the country is not interested, right? At least the official bodies of this country, the official institutions are not interested in helping Black people be able to do this in a coherent fashion, in a comprehensive fashion. Because we can talk about sort of these piecemeal claims that people are making for reparations, but this is an attempt to do this at a national scale. And I think it's clear that we are happy to continue kicking this can down the road and leaving it for some other generation. And unfortunately, Congressman Conyers is now retired, and now Sheila Jackson Lee is taking up the mantle, but it still is not getting any traction.
Yeah. You know,
If I could just
sure,
say,
please do. Please
say
do.
really quickly, it is very interesting given the place of the U.S. internationally. So what we're essentially talking about is a truth commission. The job of a truth commission is acknowledgement that something happened and to conduct an official investigation as to the truth of what happened, and an official one is conducted by the national government. So this proposal precedes the transitional justice movement that's happening across the planet since the 1990s that says in the aftermath of mass human rights violations, there should be some form of transitional justice, whether it be prosecutions, truth commissions, reparations. The United States has led the way in providing the funds for and shaping the authority of truth commissions across the planet. So it is a force, and this is the contradiction about the United States. It is a force for human rights globally. So many of these efforts could not have happened without the United States, and yet can't happen internally. And this is the contradiction about the United States. It is a force for human rights globally. So many of these efforts could not have happened without the United States, and yet can't happen internally.
If one were to look in a dictionary and pull out the word hypocrisy, that particular example that you gave would stand out.
And we could say it across criminal prosecutions for human rights violations, truth commissions, reparations efforts. The U.S. has put pressure on other governments, has created committees within the U.S. Congress to study other efforts, to put pressure on other governments to pay reparations for human rights violations to their own citizens. The State Department has an agency whose job it is to collect data around the planet for the purpose of prosecutions in the future. And yet there's no counter mechanism internally to hold the U.S. accountable. And so one of the things I've been thinking a great deal about is how do you hold, you have to take the United States in its entirety in a sense that it is a major force globally and one of the most difficult countries to hold accountable across issue areas, but especially the African American case, because historical injustices are just the most difficult cases on the planet.
So, again, sitting in the seat where you are, Dr. Claude Anderson made an alarming, raised an alarming concern in that he feared that African Americans are on the brink of becoming a permanent underclass. First of all, I don't think that's a deep stretch. And if one considers that, and the cost of that to the country, and the devaluing of lives that would be amongst that permanent underclass. First of all, I mean, the civil unrest that could come from that. Talk to me about, you mentioned earlier white supremacy. Please talk to me about the contribution of white supremacy to this very issue.
Oh, that's a big one. Well, I mean, I think the thing that happens with white supremacy is it's so normalized in our culture that we do these things that we think address racial wrongs, but we essentially leave the foundation of white supremacy intact. So what do I mean by that? So we talked about a lot about police violence, right? And the ways in which Black communities, Latino communities, and others experience that at disproportionate rates. So typically what we might see happen, I mean, after some unrest, we might see maybe a civilian commission, right, that's going to investigate these claims. But who gets to be on that commission? Right? Who gets to actually mete out punishment when something wrong happens? So the civilian commission is a way to sort of quell popular uprising, right? But it still leaves foundationally this idea that Black people, brown people, and Native American people are the kind of people that should be profiled, are prone to criminality, should be harmed, can be arrested and harassed at any time. I mean, there's just a case out of Las Vegas where a police officer was taking video of people she was arresting and making them do all kinds of humiliating things for her own enjoyment and sending those videos around. And her reply was, well, I was just joking. But that's how it starts, because that joking is the same joking that gets Botham John killed in his own house.
Yes, that's
right?
a devaluing. It is a devaluing of life,
and I think that the thing about white supremacy that makes it so pernicious is that we treat it as if racism is about individual bad actors, right? That you do something to me that I can call racist, and then I can shame you or fire you, and that undoes the harm, and that undoes the problem. The problem is that police officer exists because there's a whole apparatus that allows her to exist. And that apparatus is white supremacy, which says anything that you do to violate the rights of somebody that you view as less than human and a criminal is okay because they're not white. And I think when you get to that part, this sort of individual level ways of addressing racism are less than satisfactory. That's why H.R. 40 can go without passage for 30 years because we think it's about individual bad actors. And because the Ku Klux Klan isn't burning crosses in people's yards, then it's all fixed. So we don't need an H.R. 40 John Conyers. Look at Oprah. Look at the Michael Jordans of the world. Black people are doing well. But that is white supremacy at work there too, because these are good white people who think that they are doing the right things and are being earnest and are operating on behalf of the best interests of all of us. But I think what people don't understand about reparations or any of this, even the study of it, it is about doing what is best for all of us. Because what's good for Black people ultimately is going to be good for other communities of people who find themselves in similar straits.
And it's really the point I was making about if it is allowed that that the Black community becomes a permanent underclass, that is devastating on the entire country.
It is, but it means that white supremacy is working well, right? And I think that sort of anti-Blackness part of it, right, is a key component of white supremacy. It's not enough that our whiteness makes us better. It means that it also has to denigrate you as a non-white person, and that's dangerous for all kinds of people.
So again, white supremacy pervades our thinking.
Absolutely.
And truly is all pervasive.
So there's a range of ways to think about the functions of reparations that are beyond money. And I think part of the problem in our discourse is when we talk about it as money, we can't have a conversation. I shouldn't have to pay. I didn't do anything. As opposed to the broader harm that was done and identifying then what that means today. So we're not just talking about slavery. We're talking about the continuous, systematic brutality from the police since we got here till now. Ta-Nehisi Coates identified
connecting
250
the dots
harms.
between the original slave catchers to the police of today.
Exactly. And so it's not just this historical injustice that was in the past. It created the context for the continuing harms that exist today. And we tend to talk about these things separately, but they're all connected. And a lot of the action on reparations actually is police brutality.
And I was in the car with a driver. and the subject came up. And his focus was, I don't want to hear about money. And this is a brother also. I don't want to hear about money. I want to hear about treating the psychological. There needs to be deep understanding of what has caused this, and that we need psychological, more than any money, we need psychological support.
Well, I would agree with Dr. Powers that there can be a portfolio of ways that we can go about this. So it doesn't have to be an either or proposition. It can be a both and proposition, right? We could be talking about actual financial compensation in addition to psychological assistance, in addition to educational assistance, right? It doesn't have to be one thing. It can actually be a number of things. But I think before we even get to the money and the help, we need to figure out what is actually going on in a more coherent way. Because we do know that like Black communities are systematically undervalued, their home value. So as a way of building wealth, homes may not actually be for Black people what they mean for other communities. But how do we connect that then to this police brutality piece, to this undereducation piece? And also just as sort of a practical point to this money part that your friend raised, you already pay for stuff that you don't want to pay for anyway, right? I pay for a war, we pay for a war as taxpayers that we may not believe in. We pay reparations to other communities that we actually didn't harm. And this is also sort of implicated in this. What does it mean to be a citizen of a nation that has done these things? And how do we as citizens participate in this process? Because once that money is out of your hand and you're a taxpayer, it goes into a budget, and how that money gets allocated, we don't have any say over. I don't think my grandparents imprisoned any Japanese people, but their tax money certainly did go to making those people whole. And I don't think we would suggest that shouldn't have happened.
This is a big, complex issue.
Well, and I think this is the problem with the reparations conversation, particularly as only a money conversation, is that the assumption is that this is ill-gotten gains, right? That what Black people are doing is profiting off the pain of their ancestors. And I think that is a very short-sighted vision of what reparations could be, but also the real harms that Black people face today. You know, Black maternal and infant mortality is not a phantom issue. That's a real issue that's affecting people today. Environmental justice is an issue that affects Black communities today. I mean, we look at the housing conditions in New York's public housing, in Baltimore, Flint, right? The water there. I mean, these are things that are happening right now. This doesn't disincentivize anybody. I mean, if anything, people have been working really hard to get ahead and realizing, hey, I may not actually be able to change much about my life given the debt that I'm going to have to incur if I go to college the way people say I'm supposed to, given that I may be undereducated and may not know how to move if I don't have, say, a good counselor that can show me about college or scholarship opportunities, trade schools. All of these things are community needs that are happening right now. So to people like David Frum, I mean, if other people have rights claims, they should bring them. We should go. I mean, that's what we're supposed to do if we're supposed to be a nation that is ethical and even moral and trying to be a leader globally, then all of these people should make their cases. And if it is a just case, then I say, you know, the more the merrier.
I agree. And it's interesting that when you talk to Americans about these issues abroad, they can see the human rights violation. They can see that under law, your rights were violated and that there should be some sort of reparations. Time after time until we come home. And so everyone's okay with accountability. Everyone's okay with making someone else whole until you have to do it yourself. And that's what makes it complicated because they take it personally. Should I be held accountable? Should I have to do it? What about all these different groups? And then what are the consequences of not? And also these activities are already happening. It's not a question about should these things happen. All of these groups at a subnational level are pursuing reparations in different ways. Native Americans in California courts have some Native American groups, there are about 500 of them. Some have gotten reparations for land that was taken away by the U.S. government. African Americans, through the Deidre Palmer's restitution study group, has gone after corporations for reparations and to look at, you could not exist today, for instance, New York Life Insurance, if you didn't provide this insurance before. The question now is a national effort. Can that happen? And what I've seen, at least in other countries, it's usually a national moment where the country says something must be done. I get the feeling we have the potential for that right now.
You think that we may be inching towards that?
At least in terms of it being part of the national discourse in the presidential election, in a way that we haven't seen in a very long time. That at least we can talk about it in a way we haven't. But it usually in other places has taken a civil war, horrific acts of state repression for society to say, okay, we have to be something different. We have to go on and we have to do something to show there's a break with the past. The question is, will Americans decide we need a break with the past and we need to address these issues?
And I would say, as we look down on Capitol Hill today and at the White House, there is much more of a mindset that follows a David Horowitz, who responded to Ta-Nehisi Coates. Coates made a extraordinarily eloquent argument for looking at this and examining this and giving it a full examination to see what the possibilities are. He did not have and didn't claim to have the cures.
Right.
But one must pull off the scab to see what's in the sore. And so I feel there's a much sense on Capitol Hill, and again at the White House. I don't even think it's really given a thought there. But the idea is that what he says in a simplistic manner, Horowitz, there isn't one particular group that benefited from slavery. Now that may well be disingenuous. I'm going to have you guys respond. There isn't one group that was solely responsible for slavery. Only a small percentage of whites owned slaves, and many gave their lives fighting for free slaves. So, you put that out in its sound bite, and folks who are in place to make decisions about this, that's what they parrot instead of taking the deep dive that you all are suggesting that is necessary.
Right.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, so I was going to say, so not only did individuals own enslaved people, families, but white institutions, right? And so it was institutionalized in the fabric of society, in the economy, in the political system, in the university system. I mean, this is what Georgetown is dealing with right now.
I just wrote.
Right.